All right, guys, Murph's here, and today I want to talk about this. A Polish WZ44, or some of you might recognize it for its Russian designation, the M44 carbine, chambered in 7.62 by 5.4 rimmed. Now, I'm actually really excited to finally get this thing on the channel, so let's go ahead and hop into some history. So, if you're looking for a bunch of information on the Mosin Nagant M9130, go ahead and check the description. I'll put the link to the video that I did on that particular rifle. We're gonna kind of bypass the 9130 and primarily talk about Mosin Nagant carbines, however. So, other than to say, in the interwar period, most militaries wound up going with a short rifle pattern primary firearm for their soldiers. This way they would be able to arm both rear echelon troops and frontline troops with the same weapon system, refine production, cut down on wasted resources, all those types of things. And these would generally be 22 to 24 inch barreled rifles. However, Russia did not necessarily pursue that initially. Now, post-World War I, or right there at the end of World War I, you have the Russian Revolution, you have the establishment of communism, you have the growth of the Soviet Union, all those types of things, right? And during this time period, the Soviet Union would go through a massive amount of industrialization. It would go from being a largely farm-based economy to overnight industry, which is very interesting overall. And we see a lot of developments during this time, including a switch from the 1891 pattern long rifle over to the 9130, which would include some refinements in order to make it faster and easier to produce. Now, keep in mind that, not to insult anyone's grandfather here, but a lot of the employees of these factories at this time were not necessarily the most educated people in the world. So it was a much better and easier aspect to go ahead and make these rifles very simple to produce so that more of them could get pumped out by the less than excellently skilled labor that was available to be able to produce the weapon systems. Now, Russia would do what was very typical pre-World War I, which was to have a rifle and a carbine. In this case, they would go through a couple of different patterns of carbines before World War II, including the 1938 carbine. And this was a weapon system that would be very popular amongst rear echelon troops, as carbines were intended to be. And carbines at this time were more or less just cut down rifles of whatever the main infantry arm is. It's not necessarily a completely dedicated, at least in Russia, it's not necessarily a completely separate dedicated weapon system with its own cartridge. That would wind up happening in other countries like the United States with the M1 carbine. And this is a production refinement prospect here. So the M38 is pretty much a 9130 Mosin Nagant with a shorter barrel and a shorter stock and all that kind of stuff. But the receiver and all that, just like everything that the Russians are producing at this time is in 7.62, is still a Mosin Nagant receiver with other stuff attached to it, dropped into a shorter stock, attached to a shorter barrel. Now, the M38 would be issued out to non-frontline personnel, cannon crewmen, tankers, all those types of people, and would wind up taking a backseat to production after the Germans invaded Russia with Operation Barbarossa and threw that country onto its back foot for much of the early to mid part of the war. As Russia became more and more strapped for resources, soldiers, and production capacity, they would primarily standardize around the Mosin Nagant 9130, increasingly making the rifles more and more basic, kind of an early last-ditch example, pretty much, because a lot of the other countries that would wind up going to last-ditch rifles would do so much later in the war than Russia did. Now, eventually, Russia did manage to push back the Germans and finally got their feet back under them enough to be able to start counterpunching by 1944. Now, during this time period, in addition to reducing the overall cost for producing Mosin Nagant 9130s, they would also start putting a lot more emphasis into submachine guns, because submachine guns would be cheaper to produce and were also more in tune with what combat was looking like during World War II. This is a concept that we see by maintaining a long rifle. The Soviets were apparently convinced that fighting was going to take place at 500 yards, even though literally everything showed otherwise in all the conflicts from World War I on. That's why they kept around this long rifle. Very quickly, especially as World War II turned against them and there was more city fighting and all that kind of stuff, they found that the cheaper to produce submachine gun starting out with the PPSH-41, which is an example of what would be considered a Generation 1 submachine gun, and going to the PPS-43, which with the use, the heavy use of sheet metal stamped parts, would far outpace production of the PPSH-41 and would be indicative of a Generation 2 submachine gun, would be more in tune with tactics that were actually successful during this type of fighting, which was producing a large volume of fire to be able to close with into hand grenade range with the enemy and then overrun an enemy position through superior numbers and firepower. You see where submachine guns become very advantageous for that. This would continue after they managed to push the Germans back and continue their drive against them. Now they would start looking for more short patterns to be able to achieve the same overall process. They don't need long-range rifles. They just need something that is handy and ready to go. Enter the M44 carbine. This would wind up becoming more and more the standard frontline infantry arm because being shorter overall, it was more in tune with the tactics of the time, the actual distances that were being fought at, while also serving alongside the 9130s because that production's already ramped up as well. So in 1944, they would unveil this carbine and would wind up finishing out the war with it. And by 1948, the M44 had been surpassed by not just the SKS, but also the AK-47. SKS making its debut in 1945, achieving widespread adoption, and then being superseded itself by the Type 3 AK-47. Now, also post-World War II, the Soviet Union expands even more, absorbing countries like Poland. And part of the process of joining the Soviet Union is also getting online, not just industrially with them, but also militarily. So going to these countries that didn't necessarily already have Soviet weapon systems in practice, there would be a discussion about how do we get you to our level? How do we get you into the same overall manual of arms or cartridges that we are also using so that we can mutually support one another should World War III kick off? Well, there are a couple of options that you can go down this, and I've talked about this before. So you could wind up getting a hold of surplus Soviet arms, and then you would at least have a ready stockpile up until you're able to prop yourself up and be able to start your own weapons production. Other countries would decide to go ahead and purchase current technical data packages from the Soviets so that they could have whatever the current trend was, while still others would produce their own weapon systems that utilize the same cartridges and perhaps the same feeding system, something along those lines as already were Soviet standard. In this case, Poland, joining the Soviet Union, would decide to purchase the technical data package and machining that M44 carbines were being produced on. This is where this rifle comes from. So they would produce these from the early 1950s into the late 1950s when they decided to jump over the SKS, though they did purchase some of those from Russia, and start producing their own Type 3 AK-47, which pretty much put them into a significant leap ahead technologically. They went from bolt action rifles to a select fire intermediate cartridge. That's pretty impressive. So kudos to whoever was making the decisions in Poland at the time. Now, Poland was not the only one to continue using the M44 carbine. The Chinese would also copy it in their Type 53, and a lot of these rifles would wind up going to a lot of different communist revolutionaries all around the world, fighting in proxy wars against capitalism. You would actually see quite a few of the Chinese M44 copies wind up in Vietnam as well. So these rifles still saw quite a bit of service even after being superseded by better overall weapon systems. All right, now, of course, a lot of these would wind up getting mothballed. They would wind up hanging out in different countries' arsenals, waiting for a day when World War III broke out and they needed to dig deep into their pockets in order to be able to continue to arm their troops to be able to fight on the front lines. However, in the 90s, the Soviet Union would fall, and now all of these Eastern Bloc countries that were previously leaning against Russia for a lot of different economical support and all that kind of stuff had to figure out how to do it on their own. So these countries would wind up reaching into those very same arsenals and offloading their surplus arms all over the world, be it to other countries or to different countries' civilian shooting markets, like in Europe and the United States, which is how, ipso facto, I wound up getting a hold of this particular rifle. All right, guys, let's go ahead and talk about the features of this rifle. So, right off the bat, we have a 20-inch barrel, We have a hooded post front sight on here, just like a Mosin Nagant 9130. It does kind of help bracket the sight very nicely. However, we'll talk about this more once we get to the rear sight before too much longer. Now, as we can see here, we also have a fixed folding bayonet. This is not removable, or at least it's not field expediently removable. The idea being that this gun, by virtue of this collar system here, always has this attached so that you don't have to go hunting around or potentially losing your bayonet. This is a very interesting setup. Not the first time or last time that this would be seen on Soviet era rifles. Now you can also see here we have a full-length cleaning rod. We have a handguard up on top so that when I'm choking up on the bayonet after having fired a ton of rounds at approaching enemy, I don't burn my fingies. We have a reproduction Soviet era sling that is in really good shape. It's actually very nice leather. All right, coming back to here, you can see we have a adjustable rear sight. Keep in mind that any zeroing is done off of the front sight. This sight is graduated out to 1,000 meters, and it actually has a fairly wide notch cut into the rear of it, which makes it kind of easy to quickly pick up that front sight. However, I do have to say that this is not my favorite sight picture on a lot of World War II era firearms. I much prefer the ghost ring sights of the M1 Garand or the 1903 A3. Now, something else to talk about here real quick, guys. A lot of people like to discuss whether or not Mosin Nagants were zeroed with the bayonet. There's a couple things that I'd like to observe with that. First off, whoever zeroed this rifle originally is long gone now. So unless you've zeroed it to yourself, it doesn't really matter if it was zeroed with or without the bayonet. It's probably not going to have the same point of impact that you want. In addition to that, if you do decide to zero one of these yourselves, you can make the make the zeroing process go with or without bayonet. It's up to you. You just have to keep in mind that the bayonet is going to change your overall point of impact. That's the whole point of taking bayonets into consideration whenever zeroing is occurring. Some militaries would train to be able to know what your holdover was. It's probably more likely in the Soviet Union that you just plan to always have that bayonet fixed and fight that way instead of having to know something, because we're talking about conscripts at the time. All right, now, as we can see here, we have the Circle 11 marking, which lets us know that this was produced in Poland at the Radom factory. And we can also tell that because these Polish rifles in general have just this excellent lustrous bluing on them, and it looks really good. This rifle's in excellent shape. This is a 1952 stamped model, or stamped rifle. As you can see here, we have these finger grooves cut into the stock. They're fairly deep and easy to grip onto. However, they're not exactly where I want them. I actually would have preferred had the stock been a little bit fatter out this way and the finger grooves been out here, because I could actually stretch out on the rifle. All right, you see that we have a straight bolt handle. Pretty typical of Mosin Nagants. We'd only see turned down bolt handles in these sniper models. We have the multi-piece Mosin Nagant bolt, which in the review that I did on the 9130, I kind of drugged this bolt a little bit, and a couple of people pointed out that it didn't really deserve some of the criticism that I leveled at it. I guess the best thing to say about Mosin Nagant bolts is that they are not as over-designed as a milsurp bolt is. However, they are accurately designed for what it is that they actually need to handle, whereas apparently Gewehr 98 action's designed to withstand a nuke. These seem to be very durable, very capable actions, and they don't deserve a lot of the hate that people seem to throw their way, myself included. All right, so there's the bolt, two-lug system with a safety lug located back here. Our safety is located on the rear of the rifle. We have this knurled section here. We can manually cock the rifle in order to be able to get a second strike capability, and then in order to activate the safety, we pull back on this knurled section, and then we rotate this direction. So, like so. Now, that hood is up against the receiver, the split receiver design, so that we can no longer pull the trigger. Then in order to turn the safety off, we pull back yet again, and we realign that hood with the split receiver so that it can now be fired. You can see there. All right, as you guys can see here, we have an exposed magazine, which is kind of the expectation anytime we have a rimmed cartridge. You frequently see this type of thing. Of course, it does have a hinged foreplate, making it easy to dump ammunition rapidly should you need to do so. We have our rear sling swivels, and what's interesting about Soviet slings at the time is that they used this kind of dog collar method for installing a sling. It's very individual to them. And then of course we have a steel butt plate on the back. The length of pole on this particular rifle is set up for the average Eurasian male, which is short, and you'll frequently see tall people add some sort of stock extension to it, rubber butt pad, something in order to be able to better fit that length of pole to their body. All right, guys, those are the features. How does it shoot? Well, guys, to interject a little bit of comedy into this, or a little joke, very weak joke I might add, but a joke nonetheless, this thing is a blast to shoot. That is to say that there is a ton of muzzle blast. Now, before I filmed this, I shot up the last of some old surplus light armor piercing ammunition that I had lying around, and I was having a lot of hang fires out of it. They were very short hang fires, but hang fires nonetheless. So I will try to roll in some better footage of perhaps some more recent production ammunition that's not necessarily going to have those types of issues. However, regardless, you can still see the absolute fireball that comes out of this particular rifle. That's kind of one of the issues with carbines based around full power rifle cartridges that are more or less just cut down versions of the long rifle. You get a lot of muzzle blast, you get a lot of recoil, you get a lot of muzzle flash, and they're not necessarily comfortable guns to shoot. Now, this gun isn't too terribly bad, but having shot a 9130 and having shot this, a 9130 is generally more pleasant to shoot. It doesn't change the fact that I enjoy this rifle, it's just I definitely notice a difference. Now, of course, talking about some handling characteristics, one of the things that is often complained about with Mosin Nagants are the bolts. And that's because they kind of feel like they are held together by rubber bands. And that's because of this multi-piece construction, which allows the head spacing to be adjusted based off of the bolt. They would swap in different bolt heads until the rifle finally head spaced properly. Now, this rifle actually has one of the smoothest, if not the smoothest, Mosin Nagant bolt I've ever felt in any of these examples. So it's got that going for it, and I do appreciate that. Now, I've shot a wide variety of ammunition through this rifle over the years. I've shot tons of different types of surplus ammunition, some new production Tula and Red Army Standard, as well as a whole bunch of hand loads, brown bear, all those types of things. So I've been able to shoot a wide variety of ammunition out of this, and I can tell you overall, accuracy is about what you'd expect out of a Mosin Nagant, because we're stuck with a fixed sight rifle that's not necessarily renowned for being the most accurate thing in the world. All right, now, what is this rifle to me? Well, guys, this is actually the very first rifle that I bought with my own money. And because of that, this thing has a significant spot in my heart. I was a teenager when I bought it, and I was at a gun show and I ran across it, and I'd been wanting a rifle for quite some time, and I wanted something that I could hunt with. And the great thing about the Mosin Nagants were they were everywhere, they were relatively inexpensive, and so was the ammunition. I remember buying boxes, okay, boxes is a bit of a stretch. Really, it was paper-wrapped parcels of 20-round 7.62x5.4 ammunition held together by twine for like $4 a twine-wrapped bundle. That's pretty good. That's incredibly hard to beat, especially now when that stuff's running easily $12, if not more. So I could get a lot of this ammunition, and I was of the opinion at the time that this was more or less a Russian 30-06, which if you want more information on that, I'll throw the link to the description in that video for that video as well. I will throw the link in the description for my video on the 7.62x5.4. I don't know why that was hard to say. Anyway, so this was supposed to be my first personal rifle, my first hunting rifle. That was the plan for this. Now, I've never hunted with it, but I have shot it a lot, and I have a lot of very fond memories of outings with friends shooting this particular rifle. And I still take it out from time to time. I don't shoot it near as much as I used to, but it still comes out, and it's still something that holds a special place in my heart. In addition to being, it was my first military surplus rifle that I started collecting. And I definitely love milsurps, and I need to add more. I don't have enough in my collection. But prices have gone up, they're harder to find, all that kind of stuff. All right, guys. What would I recommend you guys do with this particular rifle? Well, that's very tricky. It's a very tricky question overall. I would not recommend this for a hunting rifle, purely because good 7.62x5.4 hunting ammunition has become kind of hard to come by. I would not necessarily recommend this as a truck gun, because I would just hope that you're not necessarily beating up these surplus rifles any more than you have to. But also, at the end of the day, it's your rifle, it's your money, you do with it as you please. I would recommend it as a collector's piece because I like collecting military surplus rifles, and there are plenty of people out there on the market who do. However, you run into an interesting dynamic whenever you talk about collecting Mosin Nagants, and that is because a lot of people consider them to be kind of trash. And I don't think that's necessarily deserved. These are interesting and very storied rifles. However, the biggest issue comes into at one time, these rifles could be had for exceedingly cheap. We're talking $100. Now, that's not the case anymore. And a lot of people have trouble adapting to that change, as though the market on firearms in general isn't fluid. And this is the thing that really confuses me. There are a lot of these rifles in the world. There's like 17 million Mosin Nagants that were produced. However, those went through multiple wars, world wars, proxy wars, all kinds of things. They've been sold all over the world in a variety of different ways. Attrition on these rifles has been significant. Then you also take into account that we're not importing rifles from Russia anymore. There's probably still millions out there that we could be getting on the US consumer market that we are not. So whatever is in the country right now is what's there. And when you consider guns being turned into sporterized models or being destroyed in house fires or seized by the police, whatever it is that's going on with them, there are fewer and fewer of these rifles every day. It's not outside the realm of possibility that they would start appreciating in price, especially since they're not being built anymore, nor are they being imported. So a rifle that used to cost $100 should not be a surprise to see it going for over $300, which is what I'm consistently seeing on pricing for Mosin Nagants. This is reality. This is how things work. We used to be able to get SKSs for $60. Now you're looking at easily $400 on an SKS. Things appreciate, especially once they become collectible. You want to talk about Glocks and stuff like that? I have zero interest in paying over $400 for a used Glock because they're everywhere. And if I'm going to pay over $400 for it, I might as well go buy a new one. It's going to be a long time before Glocks start appreciating in price. That is not the case for the Mosin Nagant. That time is now. So just keep that in mind whenever people turn up their noses at a more costly Mosin Nagant. Times change. Things change. It happens. So, if you're looking for an investment piece, this is where military surplus rifles come in. This is where the Mosin Nagant comes in. I would be able to turn around and sell this rifle for double, if not triple, what I paid for it, especially since it's still in excellent condition. I've got a little bit of pitting on the bolt because all these bolts were left in the white, so sometimes they have a tendency to attract a little bit of some surface rust, but I've been trying to keep up with it. Now I'm kind of on my back foot with it. I probably should have been more on top of it, but even still, the bore is in great condition. The rest of the bluing is in excellent condition. The stock is in great condition. A couple of bumps and some nicks here and there, but not unexpected for a surplus rifle. So, investment piece for sure. All right, guys. I think that pretty much covers my thoughts on this particular rifle. I hope you found this interesting, and barring some updates, that's pretty much what I got. Have a good day. All right, guys, so channel updates. If you guys enjoyed this content, if you're interested in more content or perhaps some behind the scenes type stuff, maybe some discussions and chats and all that sort of thing, check out the Merslaw Facebook page, link in the description. It is, and we're building a community of like-minded people who want to just share information, talk about gear, guns, equipment, all that type of stuff, and expand our overall knowledge together. So if that's something that interests you, go ahead and check the description. Join us there. We'd love to have you. And that's pretty much what I got. Have a good day.